Nations. We thank the Native communities of the Salt River Valley, including the Accomal Otham and Peepash Nations, who have inhabited this place for centuries and whose stewardship of the land and waterways allows us to be here now. We also recognize that land acknowledgements in and of themselves are not enough. Project Humanities is therefore committed to supporting Native communities by promoting and learning about Indigenous histories, cultures, and values, creating critical environments where Native individuals and communities are welcomed and valued, and collaborating with Indigenous nations in this region to protect Native sovereignty, governance, and jurisdiction over their territories. So thank you again for coming. I have been talking, and we have been talking about this topic for a while, and we actually shifted our Project Humanities fall programming to accommodate this because this feels like it's having the fingers on the pulse of what's happening both locally and nationally, but also within our state. So in order to have this conversation in a productive way and an informed way, I invited a few of my old and new friends. These friends happen to be 2019 State Teachers of the Year. They are esteemed, they know exactly what's happening in the classroom, and they themselves have been or are in the classroom. So as I introduce our panelists for tonight, I'd like for you to sort of tell us, as we typically ask, where are you joining us from? Because we like to see our reach. Where are you joining us from? And then I've got some other engagement questions. But first on deck is Dr. Kareem Neal. Dr. Kareem Neal is a self-contained special education teacher in Phoenix and has taught students with cognitive delays for 23 years. He is our 2019 Arizona Teacher of the Year and was recently awarded an honorary doctorate from Northern Arizona University for his many contributions to special education in Arizona. A member of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, he helped pilot the National Network of State Teachers of the Year mentorship program. He's also a restorative justice trainer for the Phoenix Union High School District, where he focuses on building community through eliminating bias that comes from lack of connection with other people who are different. And Kareem, what you do is at the center of what we are talking about tonight. So we look forward to your perspective. And then we have Stacy McAdoo. Stacy comes to us from Arkansas, the great state of Arkansas, the place of the historic Central High School in Little Rock. She teaches communications and AVID, advancement via individual determination. She has had a vision over 20 years ago that she would one day stand and speak to a crowd of millions. And she interpreted that vision to mean she would change the world as a writer, as an educator, as an advocate for students. McAdoo holds a Bachelor of Arts in Professional and Technical Writing from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock and a Master of Arts in Teaching from the University of Arkansas at Monticello. Thank you, Stacy, for joining us. We look forward to hearing what you have to say about what's going on in Arkansas. And then last, but certainly not least, is Kelly May, an educator of 26 years with the Salt Lake City School District and Utah's 2019 State Teacher of the Year. Most of her 23 years in the classroom was in secondary education, teaching social studies and AVID, advancement again as Stacy McAdoo. Kelly is currently an education specialist focusing on supports for new and pre-service educators, and she is also an associate instructor for the Urban Institute for Teacher Education at the University of Utah. So do we have a panel for you tonight? So let's give them a virtual round of applause. Okay, my old friend and new friend, let's get this party started. Please. I am negligent because I do need to, wait. I need to introduce our student because we are, it's interesting how we can have conversations about our students without our students being present. So when we thought about this, we thought we certainly have to bring the teachers in, but we also need to bring at least a student representation in. So Nandini is a Project Humanities high school intern, And she is a senior at a Basis Chandler and has been an intern at Project Humanities since June of 2021. Aside from being extremely passionate about social justice, Nandini also enjoys singing, dancing, drawing, and playing the violin and piano. She is also the current Basis Chandler Senior Leader Secretary, Mock Trial Team 1 Captain, and Director of the Youth Artist Development Association Youth Committee. So Nandini, thank you, and we have a place for you in this conversation. So sit tight, because we're gonna have you bringing up the rear, all right? All right. Nope, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet. Thank you. I want to know, for those who are out there in what my friend would call the virtual pews, to tell us, attendees, what do you already know about critical race theory? What do you already know about critical race theory? Add that to the chat, please, and we'll be looking at where the patterns are. What do you already know about critical race theory, so that we can at least have a baseline to see what people are already bringing to the table? And as you see certain things, Kareem and Stacy and Kelly, feel free to bring those up so that we can start that conversation there. What do you already know?
The first one I saw that stood out was that most people don't know what it is.
Bingo,
like,
bingo,
yes.
Bingo. All right, bingo, yes. All right, okay. What else do you see out there?
Well, on the flip side, the first one I saw was, I know a lot because I'm an attorney.
Oh my goodness. Well, that helps with our conversation. Okay. Anything, give me one more.
They're noticing that it's a hot topic, hot debate topic right now.
It's a hot topic, and a hot topic like we might see on Wendy Williams, except this is in the classroom, a hot topic. Now, the other part of this is I want to know, what do you want to know about critical race theory? What do you want to know about critical race theory? And then we'll go into sort of defining it. So what do people want to know, Teachers of the Year?
We want to know everything.
Oh, wait a minute. Wait, don't come to us asking for everything, because you're going to be disappointed then.
Someone said the real facts.
Yeah.
and nothing but the facts.
Why it's such a hot topic, or why? Like, why are we debating this?
Okay, why are we debating? You know, I asked that too. All right, so let's get into that. So we know that people know that it's connected to the law. We know people know it's a hot button topic, but so many people are actually confused by it, I think. So let's see if we can sort of help address that confusion. So does anybody on the panel want to give us the most succinct way that you talk about or tell people what critical race theory is? Just the most succinct, because there are definitions out there everywhere.
For me, it's simply something that was started around the 70s that is about systemic racism, not about individual people who have prejudices. And it's in every institution within America.
Okay, all right. Anybody else?
Mine is similar. I actually had a conversation today with a person that I was telling I was going to be doing this panel, and they were like, "So tell me what it is."
Yes.
And I said it just because she said simplify it. So I said it recognizes that systemic racism is a part of our society, and kind of, you know, we have to deal with it as such, and you know, move in that way, knowing that it is a part of our society. You know, and not to get crazy with it.
Okay, so I heard some things there is systemic and structural. Kelly, did you want to add anything to that?
Just that I like to kind of clarify for people that it's a lot about the study of it, the theories surrounding it, and they exist in you know, post-secondary education, and it is not a common topic or any related topics that are taught in regular K-12 schools.
Yes, in fact, and that's the heart of what we want to say. And I want to go back to just sort of clarifying historically that this became a thing in the 1970s, which is interesting contextually because nobody was sort of challenging it then. So the question becomes, why are we having this brouhaha, this big political kerfuffle over this now? Okay, so that's important to put a pin in that. This started, and I'm reading here from Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a professor at UCLA and also the Columbia Law School. And in this conversation that she had in July of 2021, here's what she says. She says, critical race theory really is a way of analyzing, looking at law's role in both race and racism. It was a product of the civil rights activists and students and professors who came into the academy, came into law schools right at the moment when the forward momentum of the civil rights movement was receding. In fact, she says that conservative Supreme Court was starting to limit the scope of what racial justice could actually achieve through the law. So our goal was to understand the ways in which the law makes racial discrimination appear to be inevitable. Now, is anybody teaching that in K through 12 classroom? If you know somebody teaching that, please raise your hand. In K through 12 classroom, okay? So that's one myth we are dispelling right off the bat, all right? She said, so our goal as these activists and teachers and professors was to understand the ways in which the law makes racial discrimination appear to be inevitable, that makes racial disparities appear to be just there rather than products of policies. And then she goes on to say, what this ended up doing was pointing a finger at the law, which was not necessarily used for justice. Kimberly Crenshaw, but rather the law is how we determined what slavery was, for example. The law determined that Black women were property and that whatever, offspring they had were property also. The law did that. So by defining through the law slavery, that's how the law was connected to these attitudes that we now are exploding and dissecting about race. That's the specificity of that. Other groups, scholars, literary scholars like myself, have started to use that because what came out of that was this challenge that law was somehow a biological fact, but rather a system that is socially constructed around power and authority. Now, I don't know who's teaching that in K through 12 classrooms. So already, that has already should create for us this notion that this is bigger than what people are calling critical race theory. And the easiest way that I've come up with to talk about what critical race theory is also to talk about what critical race theory is not. And that's what I want us to see this short video. Yes, it's called The Truth About Critical Race Theory with Professor Kimberly, Kimberley Crenshaw, from a podcast called Undistracted back in July. And we'll be sending references, so don't worry about frantically taking notes. We'll send a whole lot of references to this. And she's got other things that I wish if we were in a seminar, we would be reading together. But let's watch where these misconceptions come in that then confuse us. All right. So now if Rachel, you will share this 1-minute video. And I want us, as we're watching this, hold on just a second, to figure out what is this person getting wrong or missing altogether. So those who have seen it, I want you to tell us in the chat, what is this person missing? And then we'll come back and have our Teachers of the Year start with that discussion. What is this person missing? All right, Rachel.
Talk about critical race theory, which is pretty much going to be teaching kids how to hate each other, how to dislike each other. That's pretty much, I don't care what you say, it's pretty much what it's going to all come down to. You're going to deliberately teach kids, this white kid right here got it better than you because he white? You're going to personally tell a white kid, oh, the black people are all down and suppressed. How do I have 2 medical degrees if I'm sitting here oppressed? How did I get, first of all, time up, because I only got 5 minutes now, 5 minutes. 2 medical degrees, no mom, no dad in the house, worked my way through college, sat there and hustled my butt off to get through college. You going to tell me somebody that looked like all y'all white folks kept me from doing that? Are you serious? What's sickening about this whole thing is what y'all doing right now is already something I do in my community right now to speak out against stuff, because black folks are getting told by other black folks, oh, you know you ain't gonna be able to do nothing out there in the world because them white folks ain't gonna let you get no, oh, you know you're not gonna be able to do it here because you know the white man gonna keep you down. Well, how did I get where I am right now if some white man kept me down? How am I now directing over folks that look just like you guys in this room right now? How? What kept me down? What oppressed me? I work for myself from off the streets to where I am right now. You gonna sit here and tell me this lie of critical race theory? Of this the reason why black folks can't get ahead because of white folks? Are you kidding me? This is what we come to now. I can't believe we even talking about this right now. The last thing I'm gonna say right here is something that's crazy. Martin Luther King said he wanted his kids to grow up in a world where they are judged by the contents of their what? Their character, not their skin. If they let this stuff go on right now, it is absolutely doing the complete reverse of what he's doing. So when February comes, don't talk about Martin Luther King. When February comes, don't talk about Black History Month. Y'all gonna sit there and just pretty much pee on his grave with this nonsense. That's exactly what's about to happen. When it all comes down to it, the person that's gonna be suffering from this, the one's gonna be hurt from this, is the kids. 10 years from now, if this stuff goes on, whose fault is it gonna be? Whose fault is it going to be? Who we going to look back on and blame for this? Because this is stuff we talking about right now. This stuff is going on right now. I do this stuff on a daily basis. I'm in the hood. I'm in the communities. I'm out there with folks in their face. I've been doing this stuff since I was 18 years old, talking to black folks. And you know what? None of them are buying this nonsense. None of them are. But if you want to implement this into the school system, I guarantee you to the day that I die, I'm going to be the very person right there debunking stuff, tearing stuff down, letting them know they can do exactly what I did and get exactly where I am by putting themselves to work and getting there. And ain't not one white person ever going to keep any of them from getting there. So the CRT stuff, BS.
All right. All right. Woo. All right. So let's start there. What is he getting wrong here? What would we challenge? Let's not.
This is on us now.
Let's say what we would challenge. All right.
So one, I love the comments, by the way, keep them going. They're hilarious. Yes. But one thing I think he's doing that's super important to know is kind of conflating critical race theory with other things, right? So he's all over the place with, kind of, the Black exceptionalism, of W.E.B. Du Bois type stuff, as opposed to actually dealing with critical race theory. And the reason why I say that's important is because that's what people are doing. So people are taking the book White Fragility or the the anti-racist, how to be an anti-racist book, and they're saying this is critical race theory, keep it out of our schools.
Okay.
And so it kind of just conflating lots of things together that are all things that typically conservatives are those kinds of folks are frustrated with overall anti-racism, social justice, all that kind of stuff.
Let me ask you just a quick follow-up, because I tried desperately as we presented Project Humanities to make this an apolitical argument. Stacey, I mentioned this to you. How is this really not a political argument?
Well, it's not political. When you talk about K through 12, at the heart of everything, this is about curriculum, teachers, students, and learners. So anybody else who has anything to say about it really shouldn't, because it's about, in theory, it's about what's in the classroom. But I did want to kind of point on some of the things that Kareem said. One of the things that jumped out at me when I was watching the video was where he kept saying, that this is going to make people hate each other. This is going to make people dislike each other. And my immediate thought to that was that the truth and facts cannot make one love or hate. It's how we respond to these things and what's already in our heart. So if we hear something and we go out and we hate people based on that, we were already hateful.
Okay. Well, and keep in mind also, that was a conversation that was done, I don't know, a few years ago, at least here. Kareem, do you remember this, when we were trying to get ethnic studies out of the classroom because teaching ethnic studies was going to make people, the ethnic groups, come together and overthrow the government? And I've only seen one effort to overthrow the government, and I don't know if those individuals had gotten that from being in their ethnic studies class. Perhaps you can check me on that if I'm wrong. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. So what else is he getting wrong, Kelly?
Well, when I watched this video earlier, I thought it as how would I respond to Mr. Smith, or what might I ask Mr. Smith? And he brought up all this individualism and you know, you can do it. And I would want to ask him, well, then how do you account for the racial disparities found in incarcerated youth adults, in school special ed programs and disciplinary actions, among people living in poverty, racial wage gaps, underrepresentation in government and other leadership positions? If everyone is given equal treatment, how do you explain the inequities? And it's because it's systemic.
Right. Well, and how, for example, would you explain American slavery, though? How do you explain Jim Crow? If this is about individual choice, how do you explain redlining? How do you explain lynching? Do you see what I'm saying? Because you're absolutely right. And Kareem, maybe you could tease out a little bit more about what you mean by Black exceptionalism.
Well, you know, the funny part about it is I feel like that was my world was a lot like that. I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey. Anybody who knows it knows that it's a difficult place. You know, the school system was rough. We were living in poverty and things like that. And essentially, I did really well in school. I, you know, went to college, got the graduate master's degrees and all the things, right? And so that will kind of be like, so then why can't everybody in Trenton, New Jersey be Kareem? Would essentially be this Black exceptionalism. See that dude right there? You could be him. If you act right, if you just kind of not think about race and you just, you know, and fully engage in being an American, all of that is going to be fine. When obviously that's not the case. Shout out to East Orange. I live there as well. We'll talk about it. I went to Seton Hall. And so, you know, so for me, it is a way to say, well, what about all my classmates? The teachers didn't love them like they loved me.
Right.
Teachers treat them like they treated me, right? The neighborhood wasn't as kind to them as it was for me for whatever reasons.
Right.
And with the exceptionalism thing, and it holds you to a standard. They're saying, oh, there's this one person, you know, there's President Barack Obama, there's MLK. If you can't be them, you're not being the kind of Black person you should be. You know, it's by taking it, but we don't say that about white people. We don't, you can't just be a regular dude out there.
But it's interesting also that it presumes that just because you have been that exceptional, that pioneer, that you also don't experience racism.
Exactly. Like, I mean, and this also came up with the famous basketball player LeBron James, that they painted the N-word on his house.
Yes, I remember that.
Or were claiming he lied about it. They were like, how could racism happen to the richest, most famous athlete in the world? It's the most ridiculous thing ever. But I do think there's this thing where it's like you hear a person talk, you see a person's wealth or whatever the case may be, and just decide that, oh, see, life could be that easy for every single person. Life works out that way for every single person. Obviously, that's not the case.
Well, and it also didn't work out for Oprah several years ago when she was out of the country and was trying to buy a purse in a store that wouldn't let her in. And so we're talking about exceptionalism. It certainly didn't keep Barack Obama from having all the N-word stuff attached to him. So it's sort of, you know, and somebody else mentioned the bootstraps theory. What's problematic about the bootstrap theory?
Well, a lot of things are problematic with that. One, it really, Kareem pretty much said everything. Just because one person in one situation is able to do X, Y, and Z doesn't make it possible or the norm, the whatever for everyone else. But when you were talking about exceptionalism, I immediately went to exceptionalism in terms of America and the way America viewed itself as, you know, the exception, the great country. No one else is as good as us. And so part of the reason that those who oppose critical race theory, they're upset about the presentation of America not looking as though it is the great country that it was founded on in their mind. And so you have this, what do they call, like a dueling narrative or whatever about whether or not America was founded on the backs of the enslaved people, or whether or not America is this really great country that upholds, you know, these American values. And I think Dr. Lester, you actually just sort of said it. It's not that it's it's not that it's either or, it can be and both.
No.
These two things can be true.
Well, it's only true, and we're going to get toward that when we remind people about these dual narratives. And we've got one of our former Project Humanities student workers who's going to offer, I think, a really succinct comment about that. But let me read one thing, and I'm not going to ask you to tell me where it comes from, but I'm going to read it and see if you can recognize where it comes from. And let me just say, this was on something that was called the First White House Conference on American History. And it says, our mission is to defend the legacy of America's founding, the virtue of America's heroes, and the nobility of American character. We must clear away the twisted web of lies in our schools and classrooms and teach our children the magnificent truth about our country. We want our sons and daughters to know that they are the citizens of the most exceptional nation in the history of the world. To grow up in America is to live in a land where anything is possible, where anyone can rise, and where any dream can come true, all because of the immortal principles of our nation's founders inscribed nearly 2.5 centuries ago. That's why we come to this national memory. Our Constitution was the product of centuries of tradition, wisdom, and experience, and no political document has done more to advance the human condition or to propel the engine of progress. Yet as we gather here this afternoon, a radical movement is attempting to demolish this treasured and precious inheritance, and we can't let that happen. That's how this got twisted into not just about history and truth, but about politics. Any comments on that? Any comments on that? I'm not naming any names. I'm just reading it. We'll put it in a document. You can read it yourself. All right. Comments on that piece there, talking about exceptionalism and narrative.
I just wanted to kind of talk about the bootstraps and the exceptionalism thing. There are a lot of moving parts to any event or, throughout history. And instead of looking at just like as an individual who supposedly pulled myself up by my bootstraps, where was my support? Where's my network? Who helped me? Who were my mentors? What teachers? And in the, let's just talk about fighting for our independence, and we won because we were exceptional. Well, what was the weather? How did the weather contribute? How did strategy contribute? How did, different things, weird things that happened, or straight coincidences, or however you want to say. I guess they're saying it's divine intervention in a way with the exceptionalism, but it is really quite boastful, or I don't know how to explain it. It's a lot of ego to say it was all me. Well, it's all me.
if we embrace that narrative, of exceptionalism, that means that we really are the beacon on the hill that everybody should be looking toward and wanting to be us. It means also that who we are as a nation is who we are individually. And we embrace those narratives. And to challenge that narrative is to challenge the very basic notion of who we are. And when we go on and on and on, this was on Constitution Day, and you can look that up while we're chatting, Constitution Day. And it was talking about how great the Constitution and the independence. And I'm just reminded of what Toni Morrison says, because this is where the critical race theory came, was this notion of questioning. We talk about critical race theory, we at least, that's what I think we do as teachers, is we want our students to ask questions. To ask questions of a text and not just to accept it because somebody told us it was true. So the question that one might ask is, well, where are the people who are not the founding fathers? And what did the founding fathers find if Indigenous people were already here? And then the race part, because Kimberly Crenshaw and Richard Delgado told us that race is a social construct, despite what some of the pseudoscience was trying to tell us, that there was nothing biologically in race that was a fact, that it was all convenience and it had a certain service. And then the theory part of critical race theory, it's just a theory. It's not even a theory. I heard somebody say it's actually a perspective, because a theory suggests that if you do X, then this is likely to happen. This is not doing something. This is trying to analyze something. And maybe the something that you understand is that it's really not about individualism or exceptionalism. They're about systems out there. Do the systems then feed into victimizations, though? Because that's what the person we just heard seems to think, well, wait a minute, that just means that somebody's going to tell you can't do something because you're a woman. You can't do something because you're gay. You can't do this because you're trans. You can't do this. Address that part for me too.
I mean, that's just a good way for people with power to make sure they keep it in terms of finding ways to break down the argument of the folks are trying to speak the truth to it, right? So they're going to hold on by a lot of different ways. And that way is a way that they can say, you know what, we can also bring in some Black folks into this argument and say, hey, you don't want to be a victim, right? But it's the people of the power who pulled those strings in the first place to say, oh, don't have a victim mentality. Even though the funny thing is, most of the folks talking about it, folks like me, you, and Stacey and Kelly, we're good. We're not saying you held us down. Right. We're not saying you see how we were so beat up by this American system. We're saying people are constantly being beat up by this system. We should see that. We should analyze it, right? And our forefathers might not have been so perfect. So.
And people do recognize and see this. I think that's one of the beauties or the power or whatever words you want to use when people root for the underdog. They are always happy that this individual made it because they know that there's a system out there that was designed to keep them in whatever constructs they were able to break out. If it were not these systems, we would never be impressed with those who made it out because it would be the norm. We would all be walking around in that exceptionalism that we look up to.
Let me offer two pieces of context here. And this is the sort of questioning. And I go back to Toni Morrison, because I'm a literary scholar. And she says this in her 2011 commencement address at Rutgers. She said, I have often wished that Jefferson had not used the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, as the third right. Although I understand in the first draft, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Of course, I would have been one of those properties one had the right to pursue. Let's just meditate on that just a moment. So I suppose happiness is an ethical improvement over a life devoted to the acquisition of land, the acquisition of resources, the acquisition of slaves. Still, I would rather he had written life, liberty, and the pursuit of meaningfulness or integrity or truth. And that's what critical race theory, as I understand it, is trying to get at. The founding fathers didn't find anything. And it's not coincidental that there was no tsunami of stuff happening in the 70s when this happened. When did all this stuff start happening? When did this resistance start happening? Come on, we can name that because that's been in our lifetime. When did this start happening? We don't have to name names, but we know about when this all started happening. Come on, give me something. Give me something to work with now. Come on, so you got to say it out loud. Well, let me just say it, okay? The 1619 Project disrupted some stuff. What is 1619 Project for two people out there in the audience who don't know what that is? Come on, I'm not hearing you.
It's the centering of American history around the perspective of slaves and the oppressed. There was a comment earlier that's saying, curriculum being centered around the oppressed versus the oppressors teach history. Well, in history, there were the oppressed and the oppressors. I don't know how else to say that when you're explaining things like slavery, but the centering changes the not necessarily the events, but the centering or how to look at it, the perspectives.
Yes. In fact, it becomes what the 1619 Project says. Let's reframe the beginning of America as 1619 rather than 1776. And that was just like, oh my gosh, why on earth are we tearing everything down? And keep in mind, the 1619 was when those first 20 Africans were forcibly brought to what we now know as the United States. And, Nicole Hannah-Jones, as you know, who's been out there in the, in the academy sphere, because she was denied tenure, is sort of arguing that part of that is because she was challenging some of the very foundations of some of these elite institutions, and Chapel Hill was one of those. It is Chapel Hill, right? Yeah. And so that was one part of it. And remember, some of us did a whole 400-year celebration. I participated in that, and it was about looking back in order to look forward. But there was something else that was happening around this time too. And what was that? What else do you remember was happening around this time? The 1619 Project, when all this started. George Floyd's murder. And this alleged racial reckoning that folks felt the need to do something. But notice that wasn't critical race theory, though. That was what we've come to know as anti-racism work. Anti-racism work. But here's the way that those things got a little bit conflated, because once people started doing the anti-racist work, then we started saying things like systemic racism. Do you remember that? Because once upon a time, we weren't talking about systemic racism. What other things were we kind of saying that were like buzzwords?
We were saying systemic racism. We were saying anti-racist. We were saying white fragility. We were saying white privilege or privilege overall.
Yes.
Things.
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter. Yeah.
You mentioned that.
Somebody
Black
was saying
Lives Matter. We were saying things like privilege and bias. And so here's where this thing took root. So according to some of and it was actually a very well put together moment, because someone saw a way to sort of get into the national conversation by feeding on what people were most fearing. And that was a way of life was disappearing, and authority was being challenged, and no longer were we the exceptional country and individuals we thought we were, if we were, as Audre Lorde says, that mythical norm. In America, she said, the mythical norm is defined as white, as thin, as male, as young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. And everybody who's not in that is othered. And those folks who were othered will say, well, wait a minute, where am I in that picture? Why am I not in that picture? We call that identity politics, some people who want to dismiss it. We also call it political correctness. But here's what happened. A workshop was being done in one of the national agencies. And yeah, it was actually in September 2019 at a nuclear arsenal. And that nuclear arsenal had a 3-day re-education camp just for white males. And it was to deconstruct what they call their white male culture, forcing them to write letters of apology to women and people of color. I would like to say, as somebody who has done these workshops, that is a horrible strategy. That is a horrible strategy. Somebody who was in this federal training decided to send some of these workshops and exercises to a local politically conservative news show. That news show ran a story on it with these kinds of things about, white people being bad and white people are responsible for racism. And the then president got wind of that and then issued what you see here as this executive office of the president, office of management and budget. This is when it became politicized. And it's interesting because it references those very trainings. And what I would like to say is, and that was done at the Treasury Department, it was done at the National Credit Union Administration, it was done at Sandia National Laboratories. And all the people who resisted those were mainly white males, because the reality of their exceptionalism and their being the saviors was being challenged. And this is when the president stepped in. And if you'll notice the language in here, it says, come to the president's attention that executive branch agencies have spent millions of taxpayer dollars to date training government workers to believe divisive and anti-American propaganda. Now, became lumped into sort of anti-racist stuff. For example, according to press reports, employees across the executive branch have been required to attend trainings where they are told virtually all white people contribute to racism, or where they are required to say that they benefit from racism. According to the press reports, yep, there's Christopher Ruffo was the one who did it, sent it to Tucker Carlson. Yep, thank you, Courtney. And it got wings and legs and all of this, and it became these buzzwords that were being looked at. It became these, and notice that it says from these press releases. It doesn't say anybody actually attended it. I'm not ready for that yet. Oh, thank you. It says, the president has directed me to ensure that federal agencies cease and desist from using taxpayer dollars. So here was the catch here. The catch was that these trainings were mandatory. And the part that was wrong with the trainings is that they made white people feel bad and they were divisive. Can you talk to me about that? About making white people feel bad, and also this notion that this was anti-American propaganda. Can our Teachers of the Year sort of talk about that a little bit? These claims.
I know that specifically in Utah, the representative that sponsored the House resolution on critical race theory in public education specifically brought up how white children were coming home from school and telling their parents what was happening, and that they felt bad for being white, or they were being made to feel bad for being white. And those were specific examples that they brought up as a reason to need to address critical race theory being taught in public ed.
Okay.
I know there's not been one case, because it would be splattered over the news, of some teacher telling some children of color to talk badly about these white folks in their class because of how, their ancestors treated them or whatever. And so it truly does come back down to, are you somehow putting a dent in their perceived exceptionalism or supremacy? Okay. And that's the only real problem with it.
Well,
it could be frank or truthful.
but it also actually proves the whole point of this systemicness that we're talking about, right? So you have a group of individuals who feel that they should legislate and ban and stop things from affecting or making their children, their people feel bad, feel sad. Where was that legislation or for my ancestors, or for me when I sat in class and had to read books, Huckleberry Finn, or any of these books where the N word was repeatedly listed and read and said in there, or my teachers actually read the book out loud, or any of those things. So having the power to change structures based on your beliefs is exactly what we're talking about.
That's exactly what we're talking about. And it's this whole notion of cancel culture. We want to cancel if in fact there's some truth to that. And I go back to that notion that I read earlier where Toni Morrison says, I wish he had written life, liberty, and the pursuit of meaningfulness, integrity, or truth. And part of the critical part of this is trying to get at the truth. The truth was that the founding fathers owned human property. That's not a statement of fact. I mean, that's not an interpretation. That's a statement of fact. The statement of fact is that nobody actually found anything in the founding fathers because they're indigenous people here and then killed. That's a fact. That's not an interpretation. So and keep in mind that there was a big leap from what was happening in those federal trainings to what's happening in the K through 12. How did that bridge get, you're saying that, how did that bridge sort of get established? The bridge from the trainings to the classroom.
I don't know that I can answer that question, but I see a connection between this whole revisionist history that has already been in place. My little nephew, when he was in the, I don't even remember, third grade, maybe third or fourth grade, showed us some literature where it called enslaved people. It said enslaved people were happy to do their work. And it just totally revamped what history was about. And that to me is where it really started. And I saw in the comments where someone was saying that it's backlash to Obama. You know, all of this stuff builds on each other.
Which is also why critical race theory, if that were what this was aimed at, would have been done, you know, in the 70s or in the 80s or the 90s, not now in this moment, So yeah, Kareem.
And clearly a smart, maybe diabolical is probably a better word, reason for using K-12, because like you said, there really isn't a bridge. They made a bridge out of, but a bridge out of nothing. But it's very smart that, like I said, diabolical K-12, because you can now rally the rest of the masses who have even a little bit of frustration from Obama, right? Frustration from the Black Lives Matter protests lasting too long. You can then say, oh, we can activate all of these people by making it seem like our kids are actually at risk of being, you know, groomed,
indoctrinated
to be
yes. And this is where I want to bring up the slide now, Rachel, of the buzzwords, because this is what you have to look out for. And so everything that we're now talking about as anti-racist work becomes the stuff you need to look out. And that's where we get these moments of pseudo outrage and perhaps real outrage in these board meetings now. Any mention of, now look at this list. This was sent out as here's what to look out for. Here's what to look out for. Critical race theory or culturally responsive teaching. What's culturally responsive teaching, Teachers of the Year?
It's when you are taking a deep dive into someone else's culture and including them and bringing them into your curriculum and what you teach.
Imagine that, where we try to talk about education being a democratic process, where you want to have every child sort of represented and feels that that child has a place in there, that they're valued and that they belong in this country. Okay, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now, remember a year ago after George Floyd's murder, wasn't there like a frenzy of racial justice statements coming out of here, there, and everywhere about how we were aligning with racial justice and we were taking Aunt Jemima off the shelves and Uncle Ben was following her and all of that. And people were excited, or at least it seemed people were reading books. They were joining clubs. They were having, these listen and learns, just all this stuff, which felt on the one hand very performative because it didn't feel like it was sort of getting at the systemic part of this. And systemic part is harder to get at because it's everywhere. It's in healthcare, it's in education, it's in media, it's in entertainment, it's in everywhere. Culturally multicultural competence, implicit, unconscious, internalized bias, restorative justice. Now they're knocking on your door, Kareem, and telling you these are the buzzwords. So it's critical race theory. Let's resist that. Microaggressions. We have workshops on microaggressions to say that, acts of racism are not necessarily individual acts, but sometimes these are much bigger, that there's systems in place. Here's that example that one other critic offered, saying that, years and years ago, her dad and family wanted to move into a neighborhood. Maybe you can talk about that example, since you shared it with us. Was it Stacy or Kelly who shared that with Gloria?
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to share that example, which is a wonderful example between a system and an individual.
So in essence, there were two veterans who, after they came back, wanted to go and purchase homes. One was white, one was black. Both of the homes, they were given $8,000. One person, the white person, purchased a home in a particular neighborhood. The black guy could not purchase his home in that same neighborhood, but he did get the $8,000 like the white guy. So the black guy goes and spends his $8,000 in the neighborhood that he can only legally buy land and homes in. But as the home ownership over years, the black guy's home is worth, and I don't remember the exact amount, but I'm going to say
it was like 95,000.
Yeah, his home ended up being 95,000, and the white guy's home ended up being 300,000 or something.
Actually, 5. Yeah.
Okay. And so what happens with that is now this white family, they're able to be in a more financially stable place than the black family, and it trickles down to their children, what they're able to pass down to their grandchildren, and it perpetuates poverty and all of this other stuff that was grounded in legal stuff, legal actions.
That's where critical race theory comes in. Critical race theory comes in because there are laws that say you can't live in this place, or you're being directed to this place. And we now know this to be redlining. So that's where, and all of these things now, identity, allyship, all those things, social construct, all of that stuff. Now, social construct, that was part of critical race theory, but notice that when you got all this other stuff, the 1619 Project, this alleged global racial reckoning around George Floyd's murder, and you get an election that didn't turn out the way some people wanted, then that's a recipe for this tsunamic attack about what's going on under the guise of protecting the children. And look at all these words here and all this stuff that we have been sort of looking at relative to what we call anti-racist word. But here's how this played out in an official way from the very top. It says a perfect example of critical race theory was recently published by the Smithsonian Institution. This document alleged that concepts such as hard work, rational thinking, and the nuclear family and belief in God were not values that unite all Americans, but were instead aspects of whiteness. This is offensive and outrageous to Americans of every ethnicity, and it's especially harmful to children of minority backgrounds who should be uplifted, not disparaged. Teaching this horrible doctrine to our children is a form of child abuse in the truest sense of the words. A form of child abuse. Teaching these concepts here is child abuse. I'm not making the connection there. Perhaps you can help me. Somebody.
There's no connection there.
Okay. All right. And, okay, I just want to make sure, because if I'm missing something, I want you to let me. There is no more powerful force than a parent's love for their children, and patriotic moms and dads are going to demand that their children no longer fed hateful lies about this country. American parents are not going to accept indoctrination in our schools, cancel culture at our work, and the repression of traditional faith, culture, and values in the public square. Not anymore. In fact, we embrace the vision of Martin Luther King, where children are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The left is attempting to destroy that beautiful vision and divide Americans by race. Oh, my Lord, can we just say something about MLK, and then we're going to bring Nandini to the table as a student. Where has this appropriation of the last part of the I Have a Dream speech come? Not the left. Yes, Savannah, not the left. Yes, we finally said it.
Yeah, I mean, that tactic, I assume, it seems, based on my 47 years here, it seemed like it became a tactic that worked really well online. People essentially taking a little bit of what someone said and making it fit their whole worldview. And obviously, Martin Luther King wasn't loved like that when he was alive, right? Obviously, he was assassinated for these beliefs and things like that.
For trying to bring people together.
Yes, and spoke about how the white moderate needs to step up their game and all of that kind of stuff that right now would infuriate all these folks who are conservatives using his name right now. But that's become such a powerful tool, particularly in the age of social media, because you can put a quote there and then say, see, that's what he was all about.
Well, and you come right out and say it. This is what's said in the document. I'm not writing the document, I'm really reading it. The left is attempting to destroy that beautiful vision and divide America, by race in the service of political power. And by viewing every issue through the lens of race, they want to impose a new segregation, and we must not allow that to happen. Critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda, ideological poison that, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds that tie us all together, and it will destroy our country. That is why I banned trainings in this prejudice ideology from the federal government and banned it in the strongest possible manner. That's how this became politicized. And if we started with just the truth, then we could have seen it as exercises in critical thinking. And actually, for those who know, Dr. Martin Luther King was far more radical than people thought. If you read the first part of the I Have a Dream speech, it is not about, he says, I hope that there's a day when they won't be judged, but today is not that day. So that sort of whitewashing or sugarcoating King is also a misrepresentation. Now I want to bring Nandini to the table. Nandini is, as I said, the high school student. Nandini, how is this impacting your thinking and potentially what's going on in classrooms? And thank you for being here tonight.
Yeah, basically, oh, sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, how is this impacting or potentially impacting what's going on and what you're being taught in the classroom now?
Yeah, actually, this conversation is essential to what we're learning and what we have been taught in certain classes. Like, for example, we have US history, we have world history, and all of those subjects. And not even that, it's also like the English classes as well. It's also like literature, we have language and like honors and AP and all of that stuff. And every single, this conversation also impacts the choices of literature we read in those classes, what perspectives we take when we discuss those topics. Like, for example, somebody in the chat mentioned the letter from a Birmingham jail, which is one of the topics which was covered in my US government class. And we looked at it with the lens, and we looked at the entirety of the letter. We looked at exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to say and exactly how he was trying to say it. And it's so important that people take everything as it was meant to be taken, not as like a part of a fraction, which can be interpreted in many different ways. It's important that people take it exactly how it was meant to be. And there's just so much, it's like, all of this topic is not just covered in one class. There's no one class that will cover all this. Almost every single class that a high schooler or middle schooler or elementary schooler will take will come down to this and how it is taught.
Okay. And I'm just curious, the people in your circle, are they talking about this? Do they care about this? Does it seem to matter to them? And I know you're not speaking on behalf of all students.
Yeah, my school is generally a pretty close-knit school. There's not many students. We have like 93 seniors, I'm pretty sure. And actually this year, our school started a new class called Race, Class, and Gender, where it's specifically, it's a seniors only class, and it specifically talks about our history and how our history was, like the truth of our history, not from like a whitewashed perspective or anything like that. Okay. So I really, really love that addition to our course syllabus. And it, like the first week of school, I remember the teacher asked who here knows about what critical race theory is, and pretty much nobody raised their hand. Like, it's crazy how much people don't know about it. But when the teacher started explaining what it was about, like the truth of our history and all of that, the students were just like, oh yeah, I know that this is a thing. We just didn't know what it was called. So people have experienced this. Everybody knows that this is going on. Everybody knows that this is systemic racism. It's not individualized. And there are people like in the video who are able to overcome it, but generally there is systemic racism and people are aware of it at my school.
Okay, well, that's very good to hear. So stay with us in case something else comes up. So at this time, we want to see what's happening in these various states. State Teachers of the Year, thank you, Nandini. Tell us exactly what's happening in your state and how this is potentially impacting what teachers doing and what students will be learning. So why don't we start with Arkansas?
We had some legislation that was introduced where the intent was to ban all classes, clubs, extracurricular activities, anything that focused on one particular group, social justice, or any type of inequity, period. So that meant like Nandini, did I say that right? Mm-hmm. Was mentioning her race gender class. I mean, we could no longer have African American history. We couldn't have women's studies. We have clubs that are young Republicans, young Democrats, the GSA. None of those things will be able to exist because in theory, according to the legislation, we're not to have any discussions or anything that focuses on similarities or differences. So it was really weird. They also, this hasn't passed yet, or I don't want to say yet, but it hasn't passed, but they are also talking about putting financial consequences to schools and school districts who do teach and talk about these things. As of right now, it hasn't happened. We go into fiscal session in February, I believe. So I suspect it's going to come up then.
Now, did you mention something about because how would people police what's happening in your classroom?
I don't really know how they would police it, other than maybe the students would tell. Oh, they also talked about making us show our lesson plans and having parents have access to it. And some of that came about because of COVID, right? So we're all teaching hybridly online, and parents had more access into our space, and they were able to hear some of the conversations. Yeah, I think I just bird walked on that one.
Okay, all right. Well, I thought I heard from one, and then maybe it's from Kelly. Somebody said something about the possibility of putting surveillance recordings in your rooms. Did I make that up? Did I misremember that? Okay, it wasn't Arkansas.
Sort of, kind of.
Okay, all right. Okay.
So some of the schools, they haven't done it statewide, but yes, some schools have cameras and all of that in there.
Okay, all right. Kelly, and I'm saving Arizona for last just because that's where we are now. All right. Yes, Kelly. What's happening in Utah?
Here in Utah, it's a little bit of a mixed bag because we've got like intersectionalities that are competing with the attention of
don't say intersectionality because that's a buzzword.
Oh, well, we've got some parents that are, we've got anti-mask mandates and also LGBTQ protections that parents aren't feeling very happy about. But they did pass a resolution which is non-binding back in May or June. And it basically, one of the senator sponsor that was interviewed said he couldn't find a clear definition of CRT. So his resolution creates clear guidelines for school districts, which is interesting. And it's short, it's 42 lines long. It gives direction or suggestions to the state school board. I'm imagining there's going to be more coming in our legislative session in February. And what's happening is there aren't cameras being installed in classrooms, but parents are being told to have their child record their teachers or the things that are going on.
Why is that a bad thing, though?
I don't necessarily think that it is, but what it's created among teachers is there are some teachers that are like, I'm not touching any of this.
Right.
I'm just, it's going to be watered down and whether that means unengaging or what's in the text, I'm
Right.
not sure. And then there are others that are like, I'm going to do what I've done all the time.
Right.
I'm right now there's a fight over between a group of parents and teachers asking for pronouns, asking students for their pronouns. And they're saying it's a FERPA violation and teachers are going to be fined. And they have parents walking in schools and taking pictures of Black Lives Matter flags, LGBTQ flags. So there's kind of like a watchdog group, and it is, I would say, very much so the minority, and they travel around our state to different council meetings and school board meetings and are very vocal. So we'll see if that loses steam, if other people that are a little more on the fence decide to get off the fence and speak up. I'm not really sure, but some teachers are just, it's going to be business as usual for me. There's nothing that I'm doing wrong. And other teachers are really apprehensive, especially the district that I live in. They're asking them to post any books they're going to be reading. This is K through 12, where it links to the curriculum a week ahead of time, allow for parent comment, and sometimes it's lesson plan. So
Okay. And then there's Arizona, Kareem.
So in Arizona, we have two bills that came from the House, and one of them was, I believe, Rep. Udall, and it was, I believe, 2906 and 2898. Those are the exact two bills, actually, because you can go look them up. But both are about race, and one says no race is inherently superior or inferior to another, and anybody teaching as such will be fined $500. That was the first one.
Wait, $500 or $5,000?
$5,000. So sorry.
Okay, that's a big difference.
Yeah, big difference.
Okay.
$5,000, and it looks like a lot of the folks know about that bill.
Yes.
Signed a second bill that kind of expanded on it, and that was 2906. And it's tricky because they also talked about, like, the word is controversial is in one of these bills. For a lot of people, I've been telling everybody who will listen to me that it's not just the word race, it's anything that's otherwise controversial.
Or any of that list of things that we just showed on the screen.
Exactly, that counts as all of those things. So
yes.
Me being a restorative justice trainer, I could possibly be then, fined or fired because they're trying to fire people in the whole 9 yards. Right. And so what it's doing is what I think it's really handcuffing is the younger teachers, and they don't kind of have that sense of, oh, I got this, I know how to navigate my way around district or whatever. They are all feeling like, oh, I could lose my job, and they already are not making that much money, right? And so what's happening is, though, the joy of teaching is being stripped from them in a lot of ways as well because of that fear. And we know in Arizona, there's a 20,000 teacher shortage. I'm sure in Arkansas and Utah is probably not much better, but that's what's going on right now. And I mean, I do have some suggestions, but I think that's
okay. Well, that's what I want to say, because this is where we are now. Is like, well, what can people do? When 26 states, as of July 2021, have proposed legislation or executive actions banning or limiting teaching of principles associated with what we are calling critical race theory. What are teachers supposed to do?
One thing I want to talk about that I think is super important, super overlooked, is being on curriculum teams. I say that because I'm on a curriculum team, and I know it usually happens in the summertime. People aren't really, they're not. But if you're on there, you get to be a part of what goes in, right? And so I'm a history teacher and a science teacher, but special education is my thing. And so I wrote the curriculums, and they have all of that in. So it has in there, trails of tears and, the real history of it. All of it is in it. You go look at my thing, and y'all social justice folks would be like, yeah, he's doing it. But here goes what happens. So I then submit that curriculum to our governing board, who then approves it. And so what I think it gives you, and this is why I'm saying teachers should be on curriculum teams, What I think it gives you is, hey, I am teaching what our governing board says we're supposed to be teaching.
Okay.
And so my layer of protection is now them.
Okay.
Right? So you now coming after me, I'm like, oh, no, I'm teaching the Phoenix Union curriculum. This is not Kareem Neal going wild in his classroom. This is us teaching a curriculum. And so leave it to governor, because I would rather have an argument with a governing board member than a wild folks who is down with MAGA somewhere and wanting my job. And so, you know, you can have those conversations up front with governing board people, and then you can see what it's about, because I am not going to just tell everybody out there, no, be at your state capitol, rage against the machine. A lot of people are not willing to do that with their jobs. Right. But this is one way that I think we can do some things in a better way that we would be more protected.
Okay, I saw some other suggestions in our pre-work, so want to share. And then I also want people who are in our virtual pews to let us know what they are doing to sort of counter this notion of talking about America truthfully. All right, let's hear from the others in your states. What do you recommend, or what you see people doing, Stacy and Kelly?
As far as some things that individuals can do, I think is really simple. I think parents and teachers and students, the community could just stand up and support teachers. They could trust teachers to be the professionals that they are, knowing that they're going to teach true history. I think that if we let people know that true history benefits us all, I think that's a start. You could write letters. You could go up to the Capitol and testify on behalf of students and teachers and real learning. But just support teachers, believe in them.
Okay. All right, Kelly, any suggestions? Because people always want to know, well, what are people doing? And then we're going to give you a couple of sort of highlight recommendations. Yeah.
I think that joining a coalition of people who are organized, some are popping up, and both parents and teachers, educators who are frustrated with the way the policies are going or how they're being misrepresented, I guess, have been organizing to attend meetings themselves, to get materials together, to get information out there. So being part of a coalition, I think it's very helpful. And I also think it's helpful for those of you that are members of education unions to get some direction from them and to let people know if you feel that you're being restricted or treated in a way that is not appropriate, and find out what protections you have out there as well.
Mm-hmm. I also want to say one thing. I don't want to, because I've done some work on curriculum violence, and I don't want to assume that every teacher necessarily disagrees with this. So let's just acknowledge that. There are some people out there who really don't want to fight for social justice. So we're not naive about that. We've had teachers who implemented violence in classrooms by doing certain things, slavery yoga, for example, or, for Halloween in one of those states, I want to say it was Nevada, dressing up like the wall. So I don't necessarily say every teacher, but I have to say, I have to believe that many teachers are somehow committed to trying to do the best they know how. So that means that there's going to be some, you do yoga moves by talking about details about slavery. Google it, it's bizarre. So I think that we have to acknowledge too, because everybody's not fighting this cause. And we saw that from the Pew Research poll that was done in August of 2020, that there were lots of people who were down with racial justice, but they acknowledged that they really hadn't done anything. So they were still in that non-racist versus anti-racist mode. So that's what we want to say also, is that we recognize that those who want to can do things. This was just hot off the press today, and I shared this with my team here. Go to Learning for Justice, the formerly Teaching Tolerance. There's a piece today that was republished by Robert Kim that not only defines race theory as critical race theory, but it also says, are the anti-CRT laws legal? Yes, this recording will be available, Jacob. Are the anti-CRT laws legal? And what can I do to address anti-CRT laws? So there are resources out there. The real thing is to sort of, as my research assistant said, when people start bringing up the notion of critical race theory and they start talking about what it is, we can just go back to this notion, well, that's actually opposite. That's not what critical race theory does. Kelly's sense was, well, this is like opposite day. Whatever is being said about critical race theory, it's the opposite of what it actually is. So that's an easy way to do that. And it sounds like it's sort of superficial, but it really is. The idea of teaching people about histories is to bring more people into the conversation. The idea is to bring more what Project Humanities calls humanity into education. When people have been denied the rights to read and write. I was teaching Frederick Douglass today. Black people and women were not allowed to read and write. The laws forbade that. That's how the law participated in this. So it is not about saying that one group is better than the other or there's an oppressor. I saw this really bizarre interracial couple, a white male, a Black woman, and they said, what are our children going to come home and call one of the parents the oppressor and one the oppressed? It's a reductive conversation that makes no sense. But it's easy for those who are not thinking critically and who want to believe in the noise that's happening out there. And we are here to try to disrupt that. I want to give our panelists another opportunity to see if there was anything else that struck them in the comments that they want to address before we sort of wind down. Any of the comments that came up. And Jocelyn or Rachel, if you saw something in there, I know you brought up, Jocelyn, this notion of the Holocaust earlier. Do you want to mention that? Jocelyn?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I think is really fascinating is here in Arizona, our governor, Doug Ducey, just recently signed into law that things about the Holocaust of World War II must be taught in schools, and that those are going to be implemented into standards. And I found that really fascinating because you cannot teach about the Holocaust without discussing white supremacy, oppression, privilege, genocide. Like, these are just not things that you can approach without those concepts. So the idea that we've somehow decided CRT is inappropriate, but that the Holocaust is necessary. There's, I think, a lot we can read into that about white supremacy and our involvement. And what we discussed earlier is this idea of the American narrative that, the American soldier coming in to rescue folks is the image we're trying to protect. And that's displayed in World War II history textbooks, right? That the American soldier that was, fighting for the South, or, standing outside, National Guard soldiers standing outside of schools to keep Black kids out of school, that's the part we're trying to hide, right? So I just think it's a really fascinating coincidence, I'm making air quotes right now, that these two things are happening at the same time.
We could probably explain that, though, couldn't we? Explain why we can sort of use that as something that's going to be used versus something that we're not going to talk about. Teachers?
Well, I wanted to kind of go off of what Jocelyn said too, in that there's obviously confusion over what critical race theory is, and that it has not since the early 70s been taught in K-12 schools. But there are things being taught in K-12 schools that groups are objecting to. And rather than coming out and saying, we don't want you to talk about privilege, and we don't want you to talk about people being oppressed, and we don't want you to talk about X, Y, and Z, we're just going to use this inflammatory these buzzwords and say it's CRT when it's not related at all. And also, as far as segregation and the claims that teaching these concepts are going to further divide and segregate, segregation has been around and hasn't gone away. And to just say that it's going to further divide divisions that are already there, or segregated systems that are there. To me, I taught US government for many years, and to high school seniors, juniors, and seniors. And politically, the political powers that be set up systems, and then they point away from them in this way so that they're blaming, they're not getting blamed. The two different sides are blaming each other, right? So it's just interesting that they're calling out segregation like we're going to become more segregated, like it ever went away.
And I mentioned to Jocelyn earlier, I said it's much easier to talk about the Holocaust potentially because it happened elsewhere than when we're talking about an identity that we're connected to on our soil. So we can always point fingers about, somebody else's domestic abuse in their house rather than looking at what's going on in ours. So to me, that makes perfect sense because you could say, oh, we're not talking about difference. We're just not talking about the difference that has to do with us. And I want to bring in as kind of a last little roundup, so I don't want people to leave. I want to bring in our student because we do like student voices. She's a graduate student now. So Rachel, if you could bring up Nikki talking about these two dueling narratives that we mentioned at the very beginning. So can you bring that up, Rachel? And she's talking about this notion of why this critical race theory has become the center of this dialogue. All right. Nikki is a former student worker for us. Okay. I saw it and then it disappeared, Rachel. Okay. Oops. And there's your cute little doggy.
Called master narratives. But in my field, they're called master narratives. And of the US, we have two competing master narratives. One is that we were emerged from this country of slavery and racism and genocide. And that's something we have to continually reckon with and address and correct and work towards fixing constantly. And that's where critical race theory kind of emerges from as a narrative. Versus this idea of American exceptionalism, where our country was born of this amazing democracy and we can never do no wrong. We are this young country that escaped oppression and built this incredible system that every country around the world should aspire towards, but can never reach because it's exceptional, it's ideal, it's out of touch for. It's out of reach for all of these others. And so when different narratives like critical race theory or anything that really challenges that idea that we're perfect and amazing and incredible, for people that believe in those narratives and see themselves within those narratives, it really challenges their identities. It challenges how they view themselves, how they view our nation, how we view each other.
We want to end with this notion that somehow the making people feel bad and making, when we do the privilege walk, that it seems to center around some kind of guilt. And I love going to James Baldwin when he says, I'm not interested in anybody's guilt. Guilt is a luxury we can no longer afford. I know you didn't do it, and I didn't do it either, but I am responsible for it because I'm a human and a citizen of this country, and you're responsible for it for the same reason. And ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. And while not everything that is faced can be changed, nothing can be changed until it is faced. And that's what critical race theory, it tries to get at this kernel of truth that is also America. James Baldwin, that's a name that you should know. We should put him in there. Audre Lorde. If you're reading Robin DiAngelo, you need to read James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. Don't just stop reading at Robin DiAngelo, all right? I think that we have covered a lot of territory.
I was going to jump in there and just say one quick little thing.
Please go ahead. Yes.
That I think at the heart of everything that we've talked about, if it's about critical thinking, and if we stop critical thinking, if we no longer encourage people to think critically, then what we're left with is blind patriotism, and that is the indoctrination that the opposition is saying that they don't want. I just find,
Yes. Oh, some more final words, because you're the teachers of the year. I like that, Stacey McAdoo. All right, Kelly, any last words about critical race theory and dispelling the myths?
I would say I'm a hopeful person, and I think eventually this is all going to work itself out. it's probably going to be a long haul, and messy and uncomfortable and frustrating. But I'd say, you know, fight the good fight and stand up for what's right for students and education.
Okay. Kareem.
I was like I said, one thing I want to stress again, curriculum team, super important. Second thing is kind of crafting a message and getting it out there. So I'm on this team called the Education Civil Rights Association, and we are actively pumping out literature that is truly on task, same bullet points. And I think things like this is what needs to be happening as well, right? So yours, I think you said 600 people registered. It looks like people are going to be watching recordings.
Yes.
That's the kind of stuff that we need y'all to be asking your district leader, hey, can we do something on CRT? Can we do, you know, not teach CRT? Can we, you know, have a conversation about it and then have someone who's ready to say, oh, this is what it is. Let's keep this thing simple and plain so that no one can manipulate you with it.
Well, and keep coming to these events so that you help us understand, because we will comb through the chat and we will pull out those resources that we couldn't see, but that you are all seeing, and we will put those on a follow-up email. We want you, as you sign out, to please give us your feedback. Please also, you know, at the end of this, we talked about, you know, the fact that we are, when we talk about justice and humanity and diversity, Dr. King said this in '67, that these are all interconnected. So when you're talking about critical race theory and truth, you're talking about the humanity of all people and the humanity that was denied, and that the law perpetuated that inhumanity. So we challenge those who are down with being better and doing better to do something, take action by signing the pledge. The pledge doesn't mean you give your firstborn child. You don't have to donate any blood. You don't have to give any specimen samples. You just have to commit to living the principles of compassion, empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, and self-reflection. That's what we're asking. That's what we're asking in terms of any conversation about justice and diversity. So we thank you so much for joining us tonight. And if you enjoyed our program, please tell somebody about it. Come to our other programs. We just did one on transgender athletes in sports. We did this one on critical race theory. We've got a forgiveness workshop coming up that is not faith-based. And we want you to follow the work that we think we're doing, especially as we celebrate 10 years of talking, listening, and connecting. Join me in thanking our panelists for their enlightened comments and perspectives. Yes, 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 yes. And please, please, please like Project Humanities and contact us when you see something that's relevant to what we're saying so that we can add that to our resource database. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. And if the panelists would stay on, because we do a little final group shot. Okay, all right, thank you all very much. We'll let everybody exit. Okay. I wasn't able to see all of the chat, but I'm glad that you were all able to monitor what was going on.
It was a lot of chat. And I was trying to keep it, and they were coming.
Okay.
What I saw.
1 second, we're still live on Facebook.
No, I know. Yep, I know. We're not saying anything that's that's private, or
I just want to make sure everybody knows.